1917. The first American-fired artillery shell was sent crashing into the German lines 2 days later, though the sector remained relatively quiet. It was a week before an American soldier was wounded, a lieutenant on the 28th, a private on the 29th. Prior to the Battle of Cantigny, the first real action was at Artois on November 3, 1917, when a German artillery barrage was followed by a trench raid that captured 11 Americans, killed 3, and wounded another 5. It wasn't that big by Great War standards, but for the doughboys it marked the beginning of serious engagement with the enemy. The war also became real to folks at home. The 3 American dead were noticed in papers across the country and became hometown heroes. On March 21, 1918, German General Ludendorff launched an offensive with which he meant to end the war. He knew he had miscalculated the effectiveness of German U-boats to stop the Americans. The Americans had now amassed 6 divisions in Europe, about 325,000 men, with more on the way. Germany, Ludendorff recognized, had to seize immediately on its advantage in defeating Russia, and it must fall on the Western Front quickly and divide the British from the French. It had to open a gap for a massive and final German invasion leading to French capitulation. Unless the German army could do that, he thought, the game was up. Ludendorff thought he had the men and the new tactics to make it work. He wouldn't waste time with lengthy artillery barrages, and said they'd be relatively short, concentrated, and of unsurpassed ferocity. Allied lines would be penetrated by fearsome stormtroops armed with light machine guns, flamethrowers, and other terrifying weapons. Gains made by the stormtroopers would be followed up by masses of infantry supported from the air. And these tactics had worked well on the Eastern Front. Ludendorff had his Western divisions trained to inflict them on the French and the British. Ludendorff's offensive, codenamed Michael, was directed at the British along a 50-mile front stretching south from Arras de la Fère in northeastern France. Under a cloud of poison gas, the Germans hit the Limes, with General Hutier's 18th Army on the southern end, making by far the biggest gains, more than 9 miles the first day, eventually driving 40 miles into France, effectively crippling the British Fifth Army of General Sir Hubert Gough. The French government once again prepared to evacuate itself from Paris, as booming long-range artillery shells came raining toward the capital. But by April 9, 1918, the Allied lines had stabilized. The crisis seemed to have passed. Ludendorff then launched a second grand offensive, this time on Flanders, farther to the north. And this was done to destroy the British army and isolate the French. British Field Marshal Sir Douglas Haig issued his famous rallying cry to his troops that though their backs were to the wall, they had to fight it out to the last man if necessary, lest they be driven to the sea and the war be lost. Pershing had hoped to amass a well-trained million-man army before hurling his doughboys against the enemy, but circumstances had changed. His best-trained troops took up positions in the line. The first major action took place south of Ludendorff's offensives, in what was supposed to be relatively quiet Lorraine, northeastern France, in a blown-out village. 2 companies from the 26th Yankee Division, as it was called, formed from New England National Guard units held the town. The division was newly arrived at the sector, having just replaced the American 1st Division, which was moving north to where the action was hot, though the New Englanders found the village hot enough. They engaged in small skirmishes with the Germans, the fights growing in size as the Yankees frustrated German attempts to capture prisoners for interrogation and inflicted major losses on the Kaiser's troops, who were rightly proud of their professionalism, military intelligence, and ability to infiltrate Allied lines. On April 20th, the Germans, hoping to expose American inexperience, walloped the village they were held up in, called Seicheprey, with artillery. The troops then burst among the New Englanders with weapon barrels spewing flame and lead, driving the doughboys out, but they only did this temporarily. The Yankee division counterattacked and retook Seicheprey. But the Germans had scored the propaganda victory they wanted, at least for domestic German consumption. The troops that the British were counting on to save them didn't really perform to the level of expectation. But the New Englanders of the 26th Division thought differently. They weren't rattled by the experience. In fact, they were exhilarated by it. They had met the enemy and sent him off, a test of their mettle and a preview of the big show to come. Yes, they had been taken by surprise, but the Germans had crept in under cover of fog, and German artillery had ravaged the American 26th Division's communication. The 26th had suffered the worst casualties so far for the American army, more than 650 men, including 136 taken prisoner, but the division had been outnumbered 5-1, they fought back hard, and recovered in a counterattack. The Germans had hit them with everything they had, and there wasn't that much of a result to show for it. Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a very short break for a word from our sponsors. American newspapers treated the action at Seicheprey as proof of the steely New England spirit. Pershing and his generals thought its temporary loss and embarrassment that needed to be expunged and looked for a chance to strike back. At the end of the Flanders offensive, Ludendorff's armies had moved another 20 miles forward, but the British had regrouped, dug in, and were waiting for the next German launch. Also digging in was the Big Red One, the American Army's 1st Division. It was the best trained division, and Pershing wanted to use it to put an American marker against Ludendorff, and it was a division that Ludendorff targeted for special attention by German artillery. The division took the place of 2 French divisions at Montdidier in northern France and was charged with launching the first American offensive of the war, meant to distract Ludendorff when he made his next major assault on the Allied line. The result was the Battle of Cantigny on May 28, 1918. The U.S. 1st Division was selected for the attack, and the object was to reduce a small salient made by the German army, and also instill confidence in the French and the British of the abilities of the American Expeditionary Force. To make a very long story short, the U.S. forces held their position with the loss of 1,600 casualties, including 200 killed in action, but they captured 250 German prisoners. The Americans reduced the salient and expanded their front by a mile. This success assured the French that American divisions could be depended upon in the line against the German offensive to take Paris. Let's jump ahead now. We're going to skip over the attacks at ChateauThierry and the Belleau Woods in the first half of June and get to the Meuse-Argonne offensive. Later on in 1918, the American Expeditionary Force was building mass and strength with 1.2 million men under arms in France, joined by more than 60,000 every week. This growing power gave Field Marshal Ferdinand Foch, who was the French general and commander of the Allied war effort, the power that he needed and the opportunity to go on the offensive, not merely to halt Ludendorff off the Marne, but to drive the Germans back, perhaps even behind the Rhine. Experience had made Foch cautious, but a spring of near disaster had become a summer of hope for defeating Germany. Foch had a special assignment for Pershing's doughboys, to attack the German salient at Saint-Mihiel on the Meuse River, south of Verdun. The Americans would go into action, led by Pershing, in a newly configured United States First Army. Pershing, if not Foch, had his eye on a bigger prize in reducing the salient. He wanted to liberate Metz, a French city a little more than 40 miles due east. This would be a battle honor worthy of his new First Army and would put it in a position to threaten the industrial Saarland of Germany. Planning for the offensive was handed to Lieutenant Colonel George C. Marshall, who was tapped to join Pershing's staff as an assistant operations officer. Marshall was known as a master at organizing, supplying, and preparing men for combat, but this was the biggest assignment of his career. He and Pershing's staff had similar ideas about how to crack Germany, but on August 30th, 1918, Foch told Pershing to scrap his planned assault. Instead, Foch wanted a massive coordinated attack along the length of the Allied line north of Verdun, all the way to Belgium. The American army was to be parceled up as needed to assist the British and the French. Pershing, who had just organized his United States First Army, didn't want to see it piecemealed into a supporting role, and he wasn't prepared to fold up his battle maps and forget his planned attack at Saint-Mihiel. He refused to accept Foch's plan. The American army, he said to the French general, would fight wherever Foch wanted it to fight, but only as an independent army. That was Pershing's right and duty, which was given to him by President Wilson. Pershing finally won the argument with a compromise. Foch agreed to let Pershing assault the German salient at Saint-Mihiel, and Pershing agreed to launch, only 2 weeks after his planned attack at Saint-Mihiel, an offensive in the Meuse-Argonne sector 60 miles to the north. The Americans would be at the right flank of Foch's big push. Even on paper, let alone in action, with the inevitable difficulties of war, the plan for the American army looked crazy. It'd be one huge attack followed immediately by another, more than 600,000 troops pivoting from Saint-Mihiel to engage the enemy in some of the toughest terrain in one of the most fortified sectors of the Western Front. There couldn't be a bigger test for the American soldiers, but Pershing was eager to set them to it. If Foch had begrudged Pershing his attack on Saint-Mihiel, the French nonetheless were generous in supplying the Americans with artillery, tanks, more than 400 organized into 2 battalions with crews trained by Lieutenant Colonel George Patton, and air support. Never before had so many artillery pieces, more than 3,000, including 5 American naval guns mounted on railway tracks, and so many planes, nearly 1,500, been available to a British or French commander directing a battle. The planes were commanded by Colonel Billy Mitchell, Pershing's talented and aggressive air officer, who intended to use his aircraft as other commanders might use artillery, hitting the enemy's rear areas, suppressing the enemy's own air power, and, when the infantry could supply him with adequate coordinates, strike against German machine gun emplacements. Once the army started rolling up the German line, Mitchell's plan would take on the role of cavalry, harassing the German retreat. When the battle was over, Mitchell's pilots claimed to have downed more than 50 German planes. The Americans also tried their hand at counterintelligence, setting up a fake headquarters. Even the faux headquarters commanding officer, Major General Omar Bundy, didn't know it was fake, to convince the Germans the Americans would attack about 125 miles further south, in an area that the general dutifully scouted, that Pershing visited, and where an intelligence officer intentionally left behind a carbon copy of fake orders which were duly incepted by German agents. The Germans prepared to meet this immaterial challenge, but they weren't surprised when the real attack came at Saint-Mihiel. The French assumed Pershing's attack would be an easy, morale-boosting American victory, and they were right. Unknown to the Americans, Ludendorff had ordered a withdrawal from the more lightly defended front line, the Wilhelm Line, to the stiffer defenses of the secondary line, the Michael Line, which meant that Pershing's initial attack was directed at a phantom. The salient in relation to the German line looked a bit like the base of the number 2, with Saint-Mihiel at the forward point of the base. The Americans intended to flank the base and leave the actual liberation of Saint-Mihiel to the French 2nd Colonial Corps, almost 50,000 men, who were incorporated into the U.S. First Army. The greatest risk to the Americans' initial assault was expected from German artillery on the high ground at Montsec, which the Americans hoped to simply skirt by launching their attacks farther east. The American line, left to right, along the base of the 2, led with the 1st Division, moving out from Seicheprey, followed by the 42nd and 89th from the 4th Corps, and from 1st Corps, the 2nd, the 5th, the 90th, and the 82nd, which is as far east as the Moselle River. Striking down from the north would be the 26th Division of the 5th Corps. It intended to meet the 1st Division at the approximate midpoint of the salient, the town of Vigneul. In the process, the salient would be crushed. The attack began at 1 a.m., September 12, 1918, with an artillery barrage, which it was hoped would clear German obstructions, chiefly barbed wire. This it did with extraordinary success because the wire was rusty, old, and brittle and burst apart when struck. At 5 a.m., the infantry moved out under cover of fog, and it made rapid progress. By noon, the Big Red One was halfway to Vigneul. The German units on the withdrawing Wilhelm line weren't the best, and some of them were close to utter demoralization. A lone American lieutenant on horseback, riding ahead to find a quicker route to bring ammunition and supplies to the forward infantry, came upon a detachment of 26 German soldiers. Rather than blasting him off his saddle or taking him prisoner, the Germans surrendered and demanded the lieutenant escort them back to the American lines. They didn't want to be mistaken for active soldiers and get shot. In another incident, an American sergeant with an empty pistol, though the Germans didn't know that, roused more than 300 German soldiers out of a dugout and into captivity. Coming from the north, the 26th Division had to cut through forest, but found these amazingly lightly defended, and by 2 a.m., September 13th, the division had reached Vigneul. By the end of September 13th, the job was essentially done. The Germans were fully withdrawn behind the Michel line, and Pershing was content to leave them there and move his troops onto the Meuse Argonne. It sounded easy on paper, and relatively speaking it was, but the Americans still suffered 7,000 casualties, the Germans about 22,000, 15,000 of those surrendered, 7,500 killed or wounded. Pershing was bullish, and the reduction of the Saint-Mihiel salient was considered an American success. It was the largest American battle since the Civil War, and the troops had executed their assignments admirably. If the German units weren't the best, they were in the process of withdrawing anyway, and it was equally true that the Germans had held this line for 4 years. In that time, the Germans had repelled 2 French attempts to drive them out, and the German High Command considered Saint-Mihiel a terrible defeat. Hindenburg was